When we proposed the DARE project back in 2016, radicalisation was really focused on studying so-called Islamist terrorism, especially the impact of people going out as foreign fighters to conflicts in the Middle East. What we wanted to do with the DARE project was to shift the debate around radicalisation. Empirically, we wanted to look at right-wing extremism alongside Islamist extremism, and theoretically we wanted to move away from an understanding of radicalisation as a kind of linear process, how people got from one point to an end point of violent extremism. So we set out with an agenda of studying radicalisation in context. We talked about trajectories through extremist milieus or radical milieus. So we wanted to look at how social structural factors came together with factors such as ontological insecurity, so how people came to feel existential threat to self or to the group. And we want to look at how both of those interacted with the actual encounter of radical messages. So we're interested in young people's pathways through those milieus, but also very much those environments in which they're encountering radical messages. And one of the things that allowed us to do was to understand young people's journeys as ones in which they had a role, where they reflected, they made key choices along the way. So radicalisation becomes not a process that's done to them, but one that has many possible outcomes. The DARE project had a number of different empirical strands. We looked at online radicalisation, and we looked at that in relation to Islamist and to right-wing extremist milieus. And the research we undertook included the studying of around 600 Twitter profiles. We undertook 19 ethnographic case studies. 10 of those were in Islamist milieus and 9 of them were in right-wing extremist milieus. Altogether, we conducted just under 400 interviews as part of that ethnographic strand of research. And we undertook historical case study work in 5 countries, looking at historical cases of radicalisation to see what we could learn from them for the current day, and also 5 studies of interactional radicalisation, what's often called cumulative radicalisation. We undertook systematic reviews of both quantitative and qualitative empirical studies that have already been published on the relationship between inequality and radicalisation. A series of expert interviews with policymakers and stakeholders in the field of countering violent extremism, and also a number of interviews with formers in the case of right-wing extremists, and also families of people affected by Islamist extremism. And we fed those into our community dialogue workshops and then into educational toolkits to use in community and educational environments. And finally, we developed a toolkit to evaluate the structural integrity of de-radicalisation programmes.
Online radicalization is an actual threat to democracy. Some of the hatred, some of the hate speech that circulates online, if it had been said in a public space such as just a sidewalk, would be identified as hate speech. We studied Norway, France, Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, Greece, and the UK. So 7 countries that were studied over a period of up to 10 years, meaning all the tweets from 2009 to 2019. Each country recollected the tweets from at least 100 accounts. 50 accounts dealt with right-wing extremism, 50 accounts dealt with Islamist extremism. We did 2 types of approaches. We did an individual level country approach, and then we did a cross-country approach. What really makes DARE stand out, though, is the fact that we studied side by side right-wing extremism and Islamist extremism, which is not necessarily the most common take. The main findings that emerged due to this approach pertain to the level of censorship that affects the Islamist extremist end of the spectrum, and actually the lack of censorship on the right-wing extremist end. In 2015, ISIS was strong and gaining territories in the Middle East. And at that time, they were actually directly recruiting online through Twitter and other platforms of the same type. And by the time we actually started the study, which was a few years later in 2018, there were no more recruitment online. ISIS was not actively recruiting through Twitter anymore. And Islamist extremism had already been tackled by Twitter and had already been severely damaged. So it's a known fact that Islamist extremists go to more underground websites that are less mainstream than the big tech companies. There'll be pop-up accounts that allow us to go to those more underground websites, but those pop-up accounts don't stay up more than 24 hours. People have to really, really search deep to find them. It's not just anyone who's randomly online who will find them. You really have to look for that kind of material. And even if you do find that kind of material, it's not going to be engaging in a day-to-day conversation type situation where you could become radicalized through everyday conversations within a group. The right-wing extremist is actually very active in growing online. They were very clear about their positions. They were very proud of the positions they were taking. In no way were they hiding the fact that they were part of the far right and that they wanted political dominance coming from the far right in the upcoming years. There was a huge gap between a far right wing who was claiming political extremism, who had a lot of hate speech, who was vindicating resorting to violence if needed to take over the state or to silence the minorities or to attack Muslims. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, when we were looking at the other sample, which is the Islamist extremist sample, there were actually no accounts that we could consider as Islamist extremism. On the contrary, we had people defending themselves from being extremists. We had them self-labeling, saying, we are not extremists. We have beliefs, we have religious beliefs, but we are not politically involved, and we do not condone violence. That was also very clear. Regarding processes of radicalization, what we learn is three main elements. The first element is the fact that it's in Twitter or Facebook or YouTube's interest that we only see content we're interested in. So people from the right-wing extremist end of the spectrum, for example, will only see content that promotes their viewpoints, and it gives the impression to people that their viewpoint is actually a mainstream viewpoint, and they aren't opposed in their views online. This actually amplifies ideology. It's pretty well documented in the scientific literature. The second element that would support the idea of online radicalization is the fact that at the time of the study, those who were the main influencers online were people such as Trump, Salvini, Bolsonaro, or other very well-known personalities. They have displaced the lines that we were allowed to cross and what we're allowed to say. So they have the opening of the gates of hate speech, which is very obvious in spaces such as Twitter. Throughout the 7 countries we studied, the main person, the main influencer, the top influencer, and by far was Trump. He shapes what's being discussed. He shapes how it's being discussed. And what we found in this study, and that was something that was pretty striking, which is not only shaped the conversation, but also brought people together. So we could go from Greece to Norway to the UK and have actually more or less the same conversation portrayed in the same way. These are not national conversations, these are international conversations. In online groups and online networks of right-wing extremists in particular, we're talking about groups of people who talked on a day-to-day basis within a very protected arena, who are not exposed to thoughts that are not their own, and who in a sense kind of build up each other to the point of expressing violent opinions, whether it's a shooting, whether it's some kind of happening, some kind of event. The internet is filled with content that allows people to actually become more radical, in addition to the narratives, and in addition to the groups, in addition to the fact that there is a lot of knowledge and know-how online. The last element is that there is censorship online and there is monitoring, but we're kind of in a situation where the level of monitoring is much lower than it was before the internet. People have direct access to the public space. Before, there were gatekeepers. If you wanted to publish in a newspaper, for example, and have access to public forums, you'd have to go through a journalist, and that journalist acted as a gatekeeper. Nowadays, the principle is publish first and then censor afterwards. So a lot of things circulate online before being censored, and some elements just escape censorship altogether. It's a hard space to regulate for sure, but it's important to properly consider that nowadays we are dealing with the possibility of people within their own homes, within their own families and friends, being exposed to ideas that are not simply opinions, are false facts, and people are very affected by it. The way to curb radicalization online and prevent radicalization online is to actually treat the online space like an offline space. There's a lot of things that are being said under the pretext of freedom of speech. There are things that cannot be said by law. The democracies that are still in place and that are still under the rule of laws must simply apply the law. Laws do not exist if they are not applied. There is an efficiency question, and there is also a time question, because more the campaigns of disinformation, as we are seeing them online, circulate, harder it's going to be to actually regulate this content. There definitely needs to be measures from the state and big tech, preferably hand in hand, to actually do the heavy lifting.
Presumption that inequality is related to radicalization and terrorism is characteristic for broad range of policymakers, practitioners, and public. Inequality is frequently considered as one of the drivers of radicalization and terrorism.
So one of the interesting findings about the relationship between inequality and radicalisation was that we found in both the systematic reviews of existing published studies and in our ethnographic data that there is a very inconsistent relationship between objective socioeconomic inequality and radicalisation. Socioeconomic inequality was mentioned quite rarely amongst both the participants in the Islamist milieus and in the right-wing extremist milieus. Now, in the case of the right-wing extremist milieus, you might expect that. Equality is often not seen as an ideal, and inequality is quite often naturalised in their discourses. So it's not something that they would then talk about as being a problem.
But one thing that is common from all our radical right-wing milieus is the complaints about the distance between what they see as the people and the elite, represented by the government, the state, societal institutions, the media and cultural influences, and he's accused of betraying the people, especially by letting in and facilitating the presence of migrants and refugees that are felt as invading and as threatening the countries to which they have arrived. But this is complicated by another more or less shared feature. That is the tendencies to see inequalities as natural, as something given that one should not try to change. And this means that they are not against a society where an elite dominates the lives of the inhabitants. The problem is that the present elites do not defend what these right-wing groups hold as most important, and that is the uniqueness of the nation. The naturalization of inequality among most of the right-wing groups participating in the DARE project is not least salient in their relationship to gender. And here, very traditional ways of doing gender are appreciated. This implies that feminism, alternative sexualities, is dismissed as not natural, and therefore as something, again, that threats the unity, the soul, and also the very reproduction of the nation. And for some groups, this also implies that sexual relationship and marriages to immigrants must be avoided. But here we must emphasize that the picture is not clear. And there are also especially female members among these groups who protest against this.
So radical narrative is one of the possible answers to inequalities and perceived injustice. This narrative offers them the possibility on the illusion of escaping from a stigmatizing condition, from humiliating condition. Radical Islam thus presents itself as an opportunity for a change of status, and thus for inventing oneself in a new and empowering identity. This is on the condition that the pre-existing social and emotional ties are broken, so that one can be reborn with a new loyalties and identification. In this sense, at the heart of radicalization process, there is what I call detachment, the breaking of the emotional and political ties. Is at the heart of radicalization, it constitutes a process by which individuals become detached from ties, which connect them to social and territorial space. By rejecting link with this lonely world or society of infidel, radicalism serves to push further a process that is already at work, as the majority of people that I met in prison can be defined as a people uprooted.
The most consistent relationship that was identified in the systematic review of existing studies was actually between subjective social and political inequality rather than either objective or subjective socioeconomic inequality. So while some of the grievances were quite milieu specific for Islamist as opposed to right-wing extremist actors, some grievances were similar, and one of those grievances very strongly related to socio-political inequality, so that sense of not having a political representation or not having been given a political voice, not being heard, or even in some cases feeling that they were being silenced.
So I would say that in general we find little evidence of a direct relationship between financial or economic situation and radical ideas. I would describe the link between inequality and radicalization as one being of relational inequality. So with relational inequality, I mean that there is a sense of difference, that there is a hierarchical relationship, and the person who experiences this relational inequality has the sense that he or she is controlled by an illegitimate authority. So the response would be to fight against that illegitimate authority, and that the intent to fight is what we call radicalization.
And it is perceptions of injustice, but it is real for person who feel as targets of injustice. Also, policymakers should be aware that counter-terrorism measures itself may evoke a feeling of discrimination, injustice, grievance, and thus contribute to radicalization.
So from our studies of the Islamist and the right-wing extremist milieus, we understood that young people themselves in those milieus see extremism as a relative concept.
When we listen to what they have to say about themselves, we notice that they do have at least one thing in common, and that is that their trajectories emerge from some sort of grievances. That is, feelings of being under threat, of being humiliated, treated unfairly, and being a victim of injustices.
Across the 9 milieus of right-wing extremism that we studied, one of the key grievances was around the influx of difference, as we call it, and that was associated in the minds of the participants in those milieus with immigration and the arrival of waves of refugees. They see society as being in profound crisis, the kind of demographic change that might ensue, that might even displace or replace, as they often call it, the white European population. And it can also express itself in terms of a fear of the loss of a unique or different national or regional identity. So a sense of being swallowed, if you like, in a kind of multicultural or globalized world, which would deny the difference that they cherish. And a particular threat status is attached to Islam as a belief and Muslims as followers of that belief. In some cases, that threat is seen as almost existential.
The young Muslims, who are also immigrants, report a series of grievances unfolding as they grow up. Racist, verbal or physical attacks, or Islamophobic attitudes met at schools by teachers, by the police, by employers, by state officials, by the media, the politicians and fellow citizens.
Many of the respondents had a history of contentious relationship too. Parents, teachers, employers, police and other state authorities. So here we see again that radicalization and radicalization trajectories are about contentious relationships, generalizing to more and more people and spinning out of control.
Another major grievance relates to a sense of not having a political voice. So feeling that they're not being listened to or that their views are somehow illegitimate. And they feel even that this failure to listen to them or engage in them or to delegitimize their views, for example through labeling as extremist, could actually have a counterproductive effect. It could actually propel people to seek alternative channels or drive them underground even, and therefore to become more radical.
For some young radicals or extremists, such grievances become something that makes them vulnerable. And in some cases, such problems become transformed into an extremist political position.
So of course we have found different types of radicalization trajectories, but I must say I've been surprised to find considerable communality across the rather different national situations. If I were to name one critical factor in one word, it would actually be rather easy. Internet. So Internet was responsible for so many respondents to direct their attention to radical sources, to bring them together with like-minded radical individuals, and to facilitate access to radical networks.
In the most extreme groups, we also find the idea of purity. So while the extreme right are defending the nation on their side, the extreme Islamists are defending the religion, both in a very polarizing sense.
So many feel isolated, misunderstood, and oftentimes there are no religious authorities to teach them. Of course, that not necessarily steers them towards an interest in violence. They're primarily interested in religion. And here the radical Islamist narrative found on the internet that Islam and Muslims are under threat and one should pick up arms to defend against the oppressor suddenly provides a frame to understand one's own situation and thereby a sense of community and a sense of meaning to life.
It is no surprise that both sides see the whole situation as something like a war between the West and Islam.
One interesting nuance is where some people see the potential passage into extremism as being not the holding of those views, but the desire to impose those views on other people. Almost universally, the red line for participants in both the Islamist and the right-wing extremist milieus is violence. And they dissociate themselves from extremism because they are not prepared to cross that red line. They're also not prepared to support violence in pursuit of their causes by other people. At the same time, they are adamant that everybody has the right to whatever views they want and to express those views. And one of the areas where we really encounter where freedom of speech rubs up against what constitutes hate speech. So one of the findings from our research really supports the idea of Macaulay and Moskalenko that there are in fact two pyramids, if you like, of radicalisation that run in parallel. Radicalisation of opinion and radicalisation of action. And actually there's quite a weak relationship between the two. So the radicalisation of views does not necessarily mean that there will be a passage into violent action.
The impact of radical messages on the internet should be considered also very much in real-world context and the real world of the respondents.
The vast majority of the young people that we talked to in these milieus did not end up as violent extremists. By looking at a wide variety of actors within milieus, we were able to see exactly how trajectories developed and ended in different places. So not only in violent extremism, but in, for example, stalled extremism, partial extremism, or indeed non-radicalisation. So people who engage with radical ideas but set themselves very clear thresholds over which they would not pass. And so we think by studying these kinds of trajectories, of course alongside the study of pathways into violent extremism, allows us to see not only how young people may be vulnerable to radicalising messages, but how they engage with them, how they reflect on them, and how they develop protective strategies to prevent themselves and others around them from passage over those thresholds that they set themselves. And this is really important because it allows us to enable and engage those young people and their situated knowledge, what they know about how radicalisation pathways develop, in our strategies to prevent and to counter extremism.
There are many different types of affected persons who become involved in countering or preventing violent extremism for many different reasons. Some of them might be family members of people who radicalized and became members of extremist or terrorist organizations, like mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers.
My name's Nicola Ben-Yahya. I'm a founder of actually an organisation called Families for Life. It's a counselling organisation for families who have been affected or impacted by radicalisation or extremism in any way. The reason I founded it was because in 2015 my son had just suddenly disappeared from home. It was an incredibly long 10 weeks before he contacted again. And he said, I'm in Syria, I'm in Raqqa. As soon as he said, I'm in Raqqa, I knew that he'd joined ISIS. And that began a very, very difficult, but a very different relationship with him. It was almost like I had to relearn how to be his mother and relearn how to have that relationship with him. Because it, obviously with what he did and with the emotions I had, it was very difficult to know how to approach it.
Sometimes these are former members themselves, members who quit extremist or terrorist groups and afterwards have become involved in preventing and countering violent extremism.
My name's Darren Carroll. I'm 53 years of age and I was involved with the English Defence League, demonstrating around the country from the year 2009 to 2011. It was all happening very quickly and we was all part of this movement. There was a lot of trouble, a lot of violence, and I thought, what's this all about? This has gotten out of control. I hung in there for a year and a half for many reasons. It's you feel like it's your thing, you started it, you feel a bit responsible, you feel a bit of a coward if you pull away from it, you feel like you're letting your family that's still in it down, and your mates. So you kind of stay in there a lot longer than what you are comfortable doing. But spiritually and mentally, I'd pulled away.
Now, the roles these affected individuals might have include, but are not limited to, speaking out against extremism and terrorism, where they use their voices with their unique experiences to inform others about the threats of violent extremist radicalization. Or they might actually engage in one-on-one counseling or mentoring. They might help other individuals to leave extremist environments. Family members also, especially mothers and fathers, might help other family members, other parents. In many cases, these parents don't know why this is happening to them, what draws the children to these movements. They feel alone, they feel vulnerable, they feel guilty. It is important to understand that for most of these individuals, the motivation to engage in PCVE activities comes out of a deep felt emotional connection to the topic. They might risk opening up old wounds. That it is very, very important to know more about the motivations, the risk factors, and the potential repercussions of involving affected individuals, affected persons in the PCVE environment.
And then when I started getting newspaper interviews and that, I basically started getting some threats. And then I got hate mail after that. So it was all about making me feel ashamed and disgracing me to my children and grandsons, and I was a traitor and all this kind of thing. And cars were getting done and windows and stuff. But I thought, no, I know this time I'm on the right side, this is me. I'm going to do it the right way. I'm quite comfortable with who I am and the way I'm going about it. And things are happening, but that's not me doing that or being responsible for it. That's other people make the decision to do that to me, so I just carried on.
So we need to understand that involving affected persons in PCV always comes at a great potential risk and cost for these individuals and also for the professionalism within the PCVE field.
So one of the things that we found in relation to how we counter extremism is that young people who are participating in these milieus are really reflective and open to thinking about what they're doing. We often talk about the targets of our policies, the targets of our interventions, and in this way we kind of turn the people that we're looking to engage into objects of that, and that's not lost on them. If you're an object of a policy, you're unlikely to engage in it willingly. Where you feel a subject of that engagement, then you're much more likely to engage in a positive way. It's really important to them that people don't see them as brainwashed. They tend to talk about other extremists, real extremists, as the ones who are brainwashed, the ones who don't reflect, who don't critically interrogate their views, and see themselves as very much as being reflective and critical thinkers. And one of our findings is that people are quite open to being challenged. They relish people engaging with them because it makes them feel that they are being listened to. They don't expect necessarily to be agreed with. Usually they expect not to be agreed with. The most frequent response to encounters with radical messages that we found was that we should engage in dialogue, or as they called it often, just to have the conversation. And they emphasised that how frustrating they found it when people weren't prepared to have that conversation with them, when in fact they felt that a conversation with them would be extremely productive. They also talked about their own willingness to engage in that kind of dialogue with people who thought very differently to them. And this seems to us a really important finding for how we move forward with new forms of countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism that engages with milieu actors themselves. So when they talk about what they would like from these dialogues or these conversations with people who think very differently from them, quite surprisingly maybe, it's not that they want to change their minds. It's that they want to be heard and to listen, and they want to have a mutually respectful conversation.
They might not have shifted their own position, but they've certainly shifted the perception that we have that these two sets of young people, or these two sets of ideas, can't interact or engage with each other.
Of course, facilitating that conversation when people are still active in these milieus is risky. It takes professional facilitation and mediation, but we think that that is a way forward that could really make a difference, and make a difference not only in a preventive sense, but engaging those people who are currently active in these milieus.
There are many different types of preventing and countering violent extremism programs. Preventing violent extremism usually starts at a very early stage, so-called early intervention or awareness-raising programs or campaigns. They try to help build some form of resistance against the push and pull factors leading some individuals toward violent extremism. Then there are more advanced programs that are usually part of the so-called countering violent extremism sphere. Sometimes there are so-called de-radicalization programs addressing people who have already advanced a lot on the radicalization pathway. Some focus on prison-based reintegration, rehabilitation work. Some conduct family counseling with family members of extremists or radicalized individuals. So you can see that there's a large variety of programs across the world. It is important to show that the resources that are poured into countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism programs are not just wasted, because the resources, the financial resources, could be spent to, for example, support statutory, non-statutory services, mental health services, education, and other forms of services that might have similar results. We also need to understand that these programs, by definition, work with a target group, a population that might be highly dangerous. So we need to find ways to measure how these programs are actually performing, if they are effective, if they are not effective, how they use their resources, are they achieving the goals. Now this is very, very hard to measure. it is simply impossible to hook somebody up to a machine and measure the degree of radicalization they still have, or to measure their resistance against extremist narratives, for example. And in terms of the later stage CVE programs, for example, de-radicalization programs, scientifically speaking, we are trying to prove a negative, a non-existing fact. For example, we are trying to prove the causal link between an intervention and a person not doing something, not committing an act of terrorism, not going back to the extremist environment, not speaking out as an extremist, or not using extremist behavior, for example. Now, scientifically speaking, this is extremely difficult because there are always many other potential reasons for that behavioral change or for that act not happening. Many have, first of all, looked at so-called impact measurement or impact evaluation, completely trying to understand the specific outputs and outcomes of a PCVE program. The problem is that we really don't know how to interpret these outcome measures. Also, we don't know how long to monitor these individuals. Should we watch these individuals 1, 5, 10, 20 years after they have completed the program? It is very, very difficult to actually legally and legitimately do that. Now, another set of evaluations looks at the process, what happens in between a client comes in and leaves the program, the so-called process evaluations. They are more focused on trying to find out if the program effectively uses its own resources, if it's well structured, if it has solid process models, a theory of change, if the staff is well trained, for example. Now, this does not necessarily mean that the program actually will achieve its goals, but we know that it essentially attempts that in the most serious and solid way. Another set of quality measures or evaluations have been introduced through the DARE project. We came up, based on previous research, with a specifically adapted structural integrity checklist. This checklist includes many factors. For example, the level of training of staff. Are there clearly stated program goals? Is there a standardized intake procedure for every client? Is there a clearly stated and communicated theory of change? Are there within the program specifically defined milestones for each client, for example? How is the case management process? How is the case filing process? All of these nuts and bolts of a de-radicalization or PCV program we listed in the toolkit and provided a checklist with definitions, with examples, positive and negative examples, with the aim to help policymakers and program designers to create highly adaptable, cutting-edge, high-quality programs from scratch, or improve existing programs and make better decisions where and how to improve these programs. We hope that this toolkit actually will help to inform the practitioner level PCVE programming landscape and policymakers to make better informed decision where to place their resources, what kind of programs to financially support, and how to quickly develop these programs from scratch if the need arises.